Okay, so thank you for those two wonderful talks to start us off. We have about 40 minutes for Q&A. I will keep a queue, so just signal me and I'll put you on it and we'll get through as much as we can. I'll start with a question for Tony. I was very struck by your invocation of imagination at the end of your talk and wondered about its relation to or contrast with fantasy. I can't imagine that you would have said maybe you would have, we need fantasy rather than we need imagination now. So I'm curious about the social psychology of your account. And there's a kind of a sense that there's a psychological framework that is driving the sedimentation of various ideologies. And yet it's unclear to me what the if there's a psychology that attaches to radical political thought, to critique, to naming things like colonial fascism or American fascism ? Yeah, I'm just wondering, where the psychological lands when you're talking about the work of the resistance, the work of the left, presumably, and the work of radical political thinkers?
Thank you. I think that there's a way those of us in political theory, thought and so on, political philosophy, don't pay attention to actual practices and simultaneously don't pay attention to what people believe. And I'm not talking about belief, right, wrong, I'm not passing judgment. But I think that politics, whether from the left but certainly from the right, depends upon, increasingly in my view, a certain kind of psychic investment. Mm-hmm. And that you don't understand that politics if you don't understand that psychic investment, which cannot be overturned by good education or by discourse. And so what I'm trying to search for is, how does one think through that psychic investment? And for me, these things are very concrete. The process began when, in the Iraq War, I'm talking to a white worker who has no job, house has been taken away, divorce has mashed up his life and so on. And he's saying to me, America is still the greatest country in the world. I'm trying to square in my mind, as somebody who's an immigrant at that time, yet a citizen, how can you be saying that and this is happening at the same time? What is the dissonance? What's the disconnect? And how does one think about that disconnect and theorize about it, because it has practical implications? So it is in that sense that I begin to think about, you know, people say psychology, and you go back to Freud, you go back to Lacan, and you begin to go back to that, but it doesn't help, quite frankly, in trying to, or even Adorno and others, and Oppenheimer and William Reich, all these other folks, it doesn't quite help in trying to grapple with this psychic investment. And secondly, for me, this psychic investment around questions like around anti-Black racism also then becomes a fantasy. And what I mean by that is that it is creating a certain kind of imaginary. that has no basis, no scientific basis, no moral basis, no basis at all. There's not a grain of truth in it, right? And so that therefore is to think through, okay, how does that become a fantasy which overtakes everything and overtakes the person, him or herself? So that you can't explain to that person that's just that true. In other words, there you can give all the evidence in the world, but it doesn't matter because you are trying to educate something that's a fantasy, or talk against something that's a fantasy. And therefore, what then, in my view, operates is that the fantasy then is tied to two things. It's tied to a certain desire. And here I'm thinking through the Luz and Qatar in particular. It's tied to a certain desire. But it is also tied to a certain kind of imagination. And what I cut a lot out of the talk. What I am trying to argue for in the present moment is disobedience, etc. But for disobedience that comes out of not the imagination, which is a faculty, but comes out of the radical imagination. And I want to put radical before that because what it requires is a certain break from the imagination that we have. Right? So all I'm trying to do in that long answer is actually complicate the ways in which I think politics operates in the contemporary world, and to take a position that says that we are not just economic beings, right? That the human speech, the human figure is a complex of a whole set of other desires and drives, and this is where it comes from. And that in contemporary capitalism, I don't call it techno because, but in contemporary capitalism, one of the drives of the bourgeoisie, the drives of the elite, was this, and this is under neoliberalism, was to capture that imagination and capture that desire. Which means that they did not have to hit us on the head. Right? We will do the damage ourselves. In other words, if you believe in certain things, and a certain kind of consumer person, consumer man, call it whatever word you want to use, then the actual move to thinking through what it is, what your human behavior is in fact doing that. And that came to me, quite frankly, when after 9/11, Bush said what? Go and shop. And I thought, why would you say that? And you would say that because shopping is not just retail therapy, but that there is a way in which shopping is a certain kind of human activity that meets a certain kind of desire and emptiness that you may feel. That in the midst of grief, that's what you need to do. And so that what I'm trying to do, Amanda, and I'm stopped here, is to think through a politics that is not just economic and social, right, and historical, but to also think through a politics that pays attention to the imaginary, to the desires, to the way in which, to what is it that shapes people's behavior, and therefore how it is that they operate. That's how that comes out, and that's where I'm trying to go with this. Right?
Thank you. So I have Mark Flatus, then David, then Susan, then Tal, then Tim. Okay.
So I'm so grateful for both presentations. We're clearly off to a terrific start. My question, thank you, thanks Rachel. My question comment is for Tony, from whom I always learn so much every time you speak. So I'm grateful for that. I was really fascinated with your metaphor of history, this I imagine there's this sludge, and it's moving, it's dynamic, but it's also crystallizing or forming different sedimentary ways. So there's this sense of how the history is never really past, that it's now in some ways. And I wanted to ask you, because this history, this sedimentation that you're describing, unless I got it wrong, it was the sedimentation of, for example, neoliberalism, anti-Black racism, fascism, question mark. So given that metaphor of history, where are acts of resistance, small and great? Where's the anti-Black racist imagination, the anti-settler colonial imagination, forms of resistance and resilience? Is it kind of a different slush or sedimentary form that collides with it? Is it tectonic plates, though most of the weight and power goes with the right? Or is it all mixed in? Is it this really kind of intimate, small and large battles here and there, contestations? So so I guess the last thing I'll say is on the radical imagination, because again, I appreciate these metaphors and this idea of break. I think that's so important. What does it mean to have these breaks that let us, in a sense, kind of think anew, But surely the radical imagination isn't ex nihilo. So how does that fit in the model? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Mark, and thanks for your kind words. I always actually read your work too. So, the radical imagination, and I like to say where I get these things from, because you don't come from me in my study at 86 Dana Street only, right? The radical imagination and the break means that if you are looking at it, you're looking at an alternative set of histories, okay? Which means, for me, you're looking at what I like to call kind of everyday practices of freedom, particularly for Black folks. And I would argue for other people as well, right? But this is the tradition that I come out of. And therefore, what that means, Mark, is that what are those particular expressions? So that how does one think of music? How does one think of performance? How does one think of writing? How does one think of, and I'm an atheist, but how does one think of religious symbolic orders, new ones that are created? Okay? To me, those are the kind of everyday things that happen. I'm going to use the words of Sylvia Wynter. How does one rehumanizes oneself? But you're not waiting for the revolution to rehumanize, but a big revolution to do it. And so that it is a question of what are the everyday practices that do that, that engage in that. And there is a way in which these things are never settled, right? That one of the things that America is really great at is the elite at least is about capturing some of those practices that emerge out of the everyday and reworking them and spitting them back us, spitting it out back to us, and then we saying that this is, you know, this is freedom, or this is what, or this is whatever. So there's a real contestation that happens, and in that contestation, in my view, the practices of life, of human life, in which people don't get up and say, I'm making a revolution, but get up and say, okay, oh, what am I going to do? How am I feeling human today? Those things become really important, right? So, and so that when I think about the imagination and where some of the breaks are possible, I think that some of the breaks are possible in other fields other than the political field, in what we understand as the political field. Although I would argue that unless the political field moves into that direction, we're in trouble, right? That, you know. And the other thing I would say is that, and this to me is, I mean, I had Gaza in here, this to me is really critical, that it is thinking about trying to form or trying to create practices of life that is very much against death. There's a Palestinian poet who was, you know, who was killed in this kind of genocide. I say openly, the kind of genocide that was happening in Gaza. And he wrote about a moment in which you can only talk about life in tales of death. And that struck me because it's trying to think through, okay, how do you talk about life and how do you practice life? Rather than have to tell it in tales of death, given all that was happening in Gaza. So my answer to you is that I'm spending time, weapons of the week. I want to spend time starring for a while on the actual forms of this process of rehumanization. But recognizing very importantly that, in my view, that there is the political field is conventional political field, and here I mean, you know, politics, you know, conventional, is absolutely critical to have a fundamental change. Right? But I'm not. But I'm also very interested in the everyday.
Yeah.
Right?
Thank you, too.
David?
Thank you both very much for really clear and helpful opening papers. I mean, the question can be for anybody, but I was really struck by, Tony, your image of sedimentation. It's not just because I'm an archaeologist, but because I'm an archaeologist, I actually started wondering if there's maybe also another kind of thing going on there in terms of fascism, which is less about the vertical axis and more about the sideways movement, particularly how some of the button pushing devices you referred to, they don't just kind of sink down into spaces of memory. They go sideways, maybe into spaces of play, spaces of make-believe. And I'm obviously thinking here about the demonstrated importance of gaming as a recruiting ground for some of these sort of machismo fantasies, which maybe has also some sedimentary value in terms of historical parallels with the roles of boys' groups and youth groups in older fascist movements. And also now spills over into physical fitness, because they don't just sit in front of a screen, apparently, anymore. So it was just a question about whether, alongside the archaeological bit, we need a kind of horizontal analysis of fascism.
I think you have put it well. So yes, okay. From my side. Yes.
Okay.
If I could, I mean, I take the privilege of having a microphone very ready to hand to say that play is also not just gaming, but play in the Graeber sense of a the invention of rules as you proceed, and it's an alternative form of time use and of governance that could actually be understood not in collusion with a vertical fascistization, but in a quite different anarchic direction.
Susan, did you want to make a point right on point, or do you just want to get on the queue?
I wanted to make a point on point.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say quickly, when I heard that, like thinking about the fantasy, like it seems to me that it's, and I'm not saying that you weren't, but I just want to make this point. It seems that it's very important to make a distinction between like play and like delusion, right? In terms of thinking about an imagination, that distinction seems really important because at least with play, there's a sense that we are, fabricating, we are making, you are trying to think outside the box. Delusion, fantasy is sort of, losing touch with reality, losing touch with in your relations with others. And I think as we think about kind of like, the imaginary and how it's operating and working, that those distinctions are so important because it really helps us have discernment about the actors that are at play and the harms, I think, and what it looks like to abuse the imagination and abuse that sort of imaginary, human impulse or whatever.
Okay, Susan.
Is it on? Yeah, actually, I was going to make somewhat of the same point by citing your work on hallucination, right? And the distinction between hallucination and, but then it's not quite clear what the other is. But the other then seems to me, and it's a little bit unfair because perhaps people don't understand, but you understand by hallucination to be a way that we can make a critical distinction between a radical imaginary and a reactionary imaginary that doesn't just put left and right in front of that term. And I think that's important because it also maybe gives us a third point of hope, which is there is another imaginary in the United States, which is also imaginary, but it's the one of we're always making progress. There really is progress when it comes to racism. There really is progress when it comes to social welfare programs, et cetera, everything that Trump is trying to destroy and working to undermine. Because if we don't have that way of making a counterclaim, it seems to me we just have to presume that people politically are on the left side, i.e. the correct side versus the non. In other words, the word imaginary doesn't give us that distinction, but if you put hallucination in front of it, it certainly does. But I also want to say, and this is to Jacques' paper, particularly at the beginning, that distinction between the imaginary and and what I will in my non-liberal way call the real is allowing us maybe not to be so generous with our understandings of heterogeneity. And I like the way you bring that back to the here and the now, so that it has a specific meaning, that it doesn't in its generality, but also that if history is left out of our concepts, that is concreteness in a Adorno sense or Benjaminian sense, is left out of our concepts, then they are really drained of political power.
Should we just go on? Okay. Tal is next.
So I'm Tal Lewis from the Department of Religious Studies. Thank you both for really fantastic beginnings. to the sessions. I think my comment also came to the issues around the imagination and the imaginaries that are being activated. And so I think building on several of the past comments, Tony, when I heard you give such a powerful rendering of the ways in which Trump had activated and adapted a particular imaginary around the nation, immigration, and whiteness. And then at the end, I think I took you to be calling for the activation of other imaginaries, very much along the lines of what Susan Buck-Morse was just talking about. And I wanted to hear more about those. And I found it interesting in your response to Mark, you gave us a sense of where to look for those in the everyday, in music. But I didn't think I heard as much about what was the content of those to contrast with the content around whiteness, nation, and immigration. And so I was wondering about what that content is. And then a closely related question then is that imagination more radical in the sense of a break than what Trump is doing? And I guess part of my concern there is if it gets posed as being much more of a break, I worry about the ways in which it blinds us to the kinds of traditions that Susan Buck-Morse was just talking about, of other sedimentation on which critiques of and rejections of Trump might draw. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Tal. There are two things. One is not just Tal, but Professor Buck-Morse. I would argue that the notion of progress, less racism, et cetera, is one that we might want to look at concretely. It is progress for whom? Yeah. Right? And that the liberalism is on the side. And my argument, I have an argument that says that liberalism was born through a certain kind of understanding of colonialism and racial slavery and the construction of so-called others and so on and so forth. And that there's no kind of, and there's no pure liberalism, right? That liberalism is in fact walks and has to walk alongside illiberalism. Not because I say that, but because its practices. You see my emphasis is always, is a theorization of practices. It's always the concrete. Is always trying to think about, okay, what are the practices and how does one theorize around these things, right? And so, therefore, for me, when you talk about tradition, Tal, I think about not traditions, but heresies within that tradition. Okay, so where are the heresies that emerge out of the so-called liberal tradition that are arguing or against that liberal tradition, that are arguing for certain things? What has happened, I would argue, in neoliberalism, is that and we don't talk about this a lot, is that one action of neoliberalism was to shut down a certain set of historical archives. Right? And therefore, what we had in Jamaican Creole language, the thing is, we say a sort of thing set. Translated into Margaret Thatcher, there is no alternative. Right? And so that therefore, that means a erasure of histories, right? Erasure of archives that have a radical set of archives in which people are trying to do a set of other things. And so I believe that there is another set of traditions. And one of the work, in my view, of critical intellectuals is to, and you notice I'm not using the word left here, but critical, one of the work of critical intellectuals is actually to work in that archive, right? Not as historians, but as also theorists in that archive, right? To think through what are the elements of that archive, and if you're in the United States, in my view, what does the Indigenous Archive tell you? What does the Black Archive tell you? Black Radical Archive tell you? Because those archives, in my view, raise another set of fundamental questions about living and about human beings, right? And so my response to you very briefly, Tal, is the other archive. And I mean, we can talk, but to me, that other archive then means not just politics writ large, but means but what I like to call the vast gamut of human experiences. Because what is it that human beings are doing in specific moments to try and come back to Sylvia Winter, to come back to try and rehumanize themselves in all fields. And you don't have to agree, because some of it, in my view, when I read those archives, I say, oh my God, right? But it doesn't matter. What you are looking at is efforts of human beings to try and find a different way to think through and to do something other than what the dominant and what power tells them that they need to do. All right. So that means that's and we can talk about it, but I can't. To me, the radical imagination has a history, as a tradition, and it is finding those and it is in those archives.
Okay. Adi, had you signaled me to get on the queue?
Yes,
You did, okay. So we have 10 minutes left, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna take the last 3 questions, which are Tim or comments, whatever they, I vote comments. Tim, Anne, and Adi. And if there's any minutes left after that, you'll get to respond, otherwise you'll just have to mull it over. Okay, Tim.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll try and make this a comment. Culture is the word I wanted to ask about. A word very important to Stuart Hall, of course. And what I took both of your papers to be doing was sounding a kind of correction of a certain narrative that has, I think, gripped the left, which is to say, which emerges out of French sociology, Luc Boltanski, Yves Chiapello. The left has lost the cultural, has won the cultural critique and lost the political critique, and that's its great failure. And I think the last 20 years or 10 years maybe have in a sense proven almost the opposite to have been the case. As Andrew Breitbart famously said, politics is downstream from culture. The right understood that far better than the left even imagined the right to have done. So I really appreciate this conversation around imaginary, around the difference between imaginary and hallucination. But I guess the question that still haunts me, even despite these extraordinary, helpful, and really, useful, brilliant papers, is what did the left do wrong to lose the conversation around culture? Why did the 60s, why did the great explosion of a kind of left liberal thinking, why did punk, why did rock against racism, why did the left simply lose the handle on the culture when we had it? The left had the culture for a few years, and I still don't understand what happened, really.
Can someone hand a mic to Anne?
I think one of the places where both of you meet is on the question of silence and silencing, or perhaps more precisely, what cannot be said, by whom and when. And there are so many ways. Obviously, I have a lot of notes and more notes. There are so many things that each of you talked about that are silenced that I want to make visible, because I think these are, in fact, the apparatus of resistance, or a mapping of resistance. One is history and the archives. like which histories we remember, what histories are not remembered, not taught, or not allowed to be talked about. I mean, who remembers the Dorr Rebellion? Nobody. And yet, there's one rebellion after another, and about economics, about economic justice, about economic equality, but also heresies is a good word. There are all these heresies. We have a whole legacy of heresies that we can build on, and that, in fact, we grow from. And this is one of the great problems, I think, is that, and I think it is a problem with the left, is that there are things you cannot say. So that I was once asked, who are your greatest intellectual influences as a theorist? And I knew what I could not say. I could not say Patrice Lumumba. I could not say Cabral. I could not say Fanon. I could only say people in the canon. Oh, I don't remember. Another political theorist, but for something, for something. And in fact, I had to refuse that. I mean, you just have to refuse that. And then, of course, that's not appropriate. Not because they're not high enough, but because you are white. And the imperative to remember whiteness is so powerful and so silencing, but also it's silencing of all those hidden psychic investments people have in music, in the arts, in their own intellectual formation that are not mentionable in some ways. And that's a problem, but it's also a place that the left can work from. But the other one I wanted to mention in that regard is the forgotten ordinary, and the way in which people initially, because this is paying a debt on my part, people keep telling me I can't do anything, and so I am going to make my family, my house, my world as good as it can be. And this made me very angry, frankly. But listening to you both, I realized that importance of the ordinary, the fabric of looking out of your window and seeing this street, of seeing that street, and the inexhaustibility of those particular material things and what they are connected to politically, that this is not the quietest impotence that I thought it was. It is actually a form of resistance. So thank you both for that.
You're going to pass? Okay, so he just gifted you 3 minutes total between the two of you.
No, I would just say very quickly, Tim, culture, yes, culture, but I'm also very much trying to think that we have to think out, that culture has become such a blasé and capacious word. I'm not sure what meaning it has, right? So let me stop it here. We can talk. I think that I don't think we lost the cultural war. I don't think it's that kind of, I think we actually lost the ideological battle. And I think that the ideological battle we lost was that we had a particular conception of what the human is, right? And that particular conception was essentially, in my view, driven very much by a certain Darwinian understanding of the human species, and that Marx, if you very very frank, that Marx and others drew from, rather than thinking about the complexities of what we are as a human figure, and therefore, the class struggle became it without understanding how, in fact, what human beings were. And how struggles would actually happen, and and how we as human beings think and believe and behave. Let me put it very quickly. C.L.R. James, in his biography, Beyond a Boundary, and in the chapter that says what is art, says, after 30 years of politics, I found out that my history, my economics, and my politics did not tell me what men wanted and what men did. He's writing 1961, so I tend to forgive him on the language. But I think that's I get that, and that for me has always been something I've written on my phone thing. That on my phone. That's what reminds me what it is that human beings want. What have they done, and what have they done to me becomes the key question.
I don't have any solution particularly to offer. Just a reflection about something that I think might be leading us in a direction I find complicated, or at least worrisome. Rehumanization. I'm allergic to the human. It seems to me a term that is so saturated with ideological uses and a long history of exclusions and partitions and overvaluations that it needs to be abandoned. And I'm not quite sure how this fits, in particular with Tim's question about the loss of culture or loss of the cultural war. But I would venture something like this. It's not that the left had a privileged relation to the human that it then lost, but rather that what has been sidestepped or avoided is a much slipperier concept of how one thinks in general, that doesn't pass through conceptualization and doesn't pass through concepts that can derive in concrete in institutions, but rather is much closer to the kind of archives that Anne was talking about, momentary, particular, explosive, ephemeral, defective forms of behavior that don't rise to the level of concepts over time, but are useful at certain moments to certain ends for certain groups, and then can be seen to fade. That seems to me to be a description of historical change and historicity that we might be able to mobilize. I was calling it babble and noise that could be mobilized against precisely the tendency toward a conceptual thought that is closural and which derives or devolves into hardened institutions that end up being anti-democratic.
So let's thank our wonderful speakers.